Council says the imminent threats against Goma are putting hundreds of thousands of civilians in the Democratic Republic of Congo at a heightened risk. Survivors joined world leaders at the site of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz, Poland on the 80th anniversary of its liberation in World War II. And the African Union's Development Agency signs a historic agreement to mobilize resources to eliminate neglected tropical diseases across Africa. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin our broadcast in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where dozens of demonstrators attacked several embassies in Kinshasa, including those of Rwanda, France, and Belgium. The protesters opposed the advance of the M23 rebels into the city of Goma in the country's conflict-battered east. Police fired tear gas at the protesters as they marched to the embassies, looting and setting fires to parts of the buildings. The embassies of Kenya and Uganda were also attacked, according to the Associated Press. The M23 rebels are one of about 100 armed groups struggling for a foothold in the mineral-rich region. Meanwhile, the Red Cross is voicing its alarm Tuesday over the risk that fighting in Goma could cause samples of Ebola and other pathogens held in a laboratory to escape. Gunshots rang out through parts of the besieged Congo city of Goma on Tuesday as Congolese soldiers clashed with rebel fighters ahead of a United Nations Security Council meeting. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
Clashes in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo's besieged city of Goma have killed at least 17 people and wounded nearly 400, hospital sources said on Tuesday, as the Congolese military fought to hold off M23 forces backed by the Rwandan army. Rwanda has denied those accusations. Dozens of M23 fighters were marching through Goma's main streets, some wearing bulletproof vests and carrying Congolese weapons. Artillery fire and gunshots are echoed across the central hub in the DRC's mineral-rich east, as Kigali said 5 civilians were killed across the Rwandan border. The rebels' recent advance has forced thousands from their homes and triggered fears that a decade-old simmering conflict risks reigniting a broader regional war. The DRC government said it continues to work to avoid carnage and the loss of human life in Goma. Meanwhile, displaced Congolese who have fled fighting in eastern DRC have arrived at a makeshift camp on the Rwandan border. Fighting has escalated in recent days between the Congolese military and M23 forces backed by the Rwandan army, provoking a mass displacement of civilians. Kenyan President William Ruto said that Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame will attend a crisis summit on Wednesday. The Africa Union's Peace and Security Council is due to meet on Tuesday to discuss the escalating crisis. In a call with Tshisekedi, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reiterated Washington's respect for the sovereignty of the DRC. He agreed to restart the talks between the DRC and Rwanda as soon as possible. The M23 or March 23rd movement briefly occupied Goma at the end of 2012 and was defeated by the DRC forces and a UN-backed government offensive the following year. The group reemerged in the late 2021 and started seizing large swaths of northern Kivu province. A UN expert report in July said that up to 4,000 Rwandan soldiers were fighting along the M23 and that Rwanda had a de facto control of the group's operations. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
For more on how the United Nations is handling the crisis in Congo, let's go live to UN headquarters in New York, where VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir is standing by. Hello, Margaret. Tell us how this chaotic situation in Congo is being addressed at the United Nations.
Well, Esther, there is a lot of concern in this building for the 2 to 3 million people who are in Goma. There's also a lot of concern for UN personnel in the city. The UN says the situation is still very fluid and very dangerous. On Monday, we heard from Bruno Lemarquis, who is the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator in Congo. He spoke to us from Kinshasa. He said the fighting was ongoing and that there were active zones of combat that had spread to all areas of Goma, and water, electricity, internet, and phone service was severely disrupted. He said humanitarian warehouses have been looted. And here in New York at 3 p.m. today, the UN Security Council is going to meet to be briefed on the situation. This will be their second meeting in 3 days. The Congolese Foreign Minister, Therese Wagner, is here. She was here on Sunday. I think she has stayed in New York. She'll be attending this session, so we expect to hear more on the situation from her. And the UN has temporarily evacuated its non-essential personnel from Goma. Some of them have been sent to Kinshasa and some over to Uganda, to Entebbe, where there's a large UN base there. And that's both foreign and Congolese UN personnel.
Do you know if the United Nations is planning any action, at least to stop the current ongoing violence, and have those involved in killing of civilians held accountable?
Well, the United Nations, has a large peacekeeping force in the eastern DRC known as MONUSCO. The government of Congo has asked for it to gradually withdraw and leave the country, so it's down to about 10,000 peacekeepers now, and they have beefed up their presence in and around the Goma area. They're backing up the Congolese army there, trying to stop the violence. Their mission, their mandate is to protect civilians and to disarm combatants. And the head of UN peacekeeping told us Monday that they are still doing that. The UN has lost 3 peacekeepers in the last few days. They've been killed, and several others were injured in the fighting with the M23. The UN Secretary General and the UN Security Council have both issued urgent calls for the fighting to stop, for the M23 to cease hostilities, to go back to the ceasefire agreement of August, which they violated, and for Rwandan forces to withdraw.
Margaret, very quickly, do we know if the UN is sending any humanitarian assistance to Congo?
Well, the UN released $17 million on Sunday from a central emergency fund to help with urgent needs. Unfortunately, today, the World Food Program said that they have to temporarily suspend their work in North Kivu due to the insecurity. And the impact of that means that 800,000 people will not be receiving the food aid that they had been slated to get. And we know it's already a dire humanitarian crisis in Congo.
Right.
But efforts are ongoing, and the UN is staying.
Margaret, thank you very much for updating us on what's happening at the United Nations. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia live for us from the UN headquarters in New York. The United States has a new chief diplomat after Marco Rubio was sworn in as Secretary of State. Rubio has taken a tough stance on China and is pledging to advance America's interests abroad, but has not been specific when it comes to his Africa policy. South Africa's president says he is confident in his country's relationship with the United States under the new Trump administration. Kate Bartlett reports from Johannesburg.
It might have been chilly in Davos, Switzerland at the recent World Economic Forum, but South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said he expected warm relations with the United States under President Donald Trump.
President Trump is a great deal maker, and so am I. So we will be able to work together.
But not everyone shares his optimism. Analysts predict that Pretoria's cozy relations with Russia, neutral stance on the Ukraine war, and International Court of Justice case against Israel over Gaza won't sit well with the new U.S. administration.
Now, for the past administration, the consequences of South Africa's relationship with Russia, with China, with Iran and, parenthetically with the International Court of Justice, were seen as irritants, and they were seen as things that make the climb up the hill harder, but they weren't seen as breaking point questions. Under the Trump administration, they certainly will, as the State Department, be watching that very carefully.
South Africa is also a staunch member of BRICS, the group of emerging nations that includes Russia and China. Secretary of State Rubio has called out South Africa in the past for its warm relations with Beijing.
Now we get the Trump-Vance administration, which is starting very clearly on the foreign policy of America first. So it will mean that if South Africa is pursuing quote-unquote BRICS first policy, it will run counter to this foreign policy and it will be in trouble.
Some Republicans have already called for a full review into relations with South Africa. Some analysts say the US could take punitive action against South Africa for not being aligned with Washington on foreign policy, such as ending trade benefits.
Yeah, I think that this sort of the length of the tether that the US will have is shorter. It's going to be less tolerant of countries that, for example, are major recipients of US aid, but vote against the US at the United Nations.
Hartley says this could either increase US influence in Africa,
or alternatively, it could push these countries out of the US sphere and into embracing alternatives.
Analysts say the US will likely continue with the Lobito Corridor, a railway project to transport critical minerals from Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo to Africa's West Atlantic coast. Another big move could be if the US recognizes Somaliland, a self-governing region within Somalia. But all in all, says retired diplomat Spector, Africa is not that high on the agenda.
As far as Africa is concerned, let's be honest and let's be fair about it. Africa is very far down the totem pole of the places and issues that the Trump administration is going to pay attention to.
For his first international trip, Rubio is heading to Panama. Kate Bartlett, VOA News, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Among the many plans that President Donald Trump has laid out was a directive for the U.S. to abandon the shift toward clean energy and increase oil production. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara explains.
Countering climate change was central to former President Joe Biden's administration. But under President Donald Trump, the United States is going in a different direction.
Today, I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
When a president declares a national emergency, he has more executive authority to get things done, including deregulating industries to drill for oil and gas. On Friday, Trump added a geopolitical factor by saying that lowering oil prices is the key to ending the war in Ukraine.
OPEC ought to get on the ball and they ought to drop the price of oil, and that war will stop right away.
Analysts are skeptical that Trump's demands and policies will significantly impact oil prices.
You have to think about things like oil supply being driven by international, demand and other things that are going to be quite separate from a lot of the different kinds of policies that President Trump may be thinking of that could, around the margins, affect oil and gas exploration and extraction.
Analysts say low prices would also hurt Trump donors, the American fossil fuel industry. Renewable energy advocates point out that U.S. oil and gas is already at peak production.
And so if this is an emergency, why aren't we looking at all available resources, particularly the ones that are demonstrating real value on the grid, right? Why aren't we using all tools in the toolbox?
Trump, who has repeatedly called climate change a hoax, wants to slam the brakes on efforts to boost U.S. electric vehicles by rolling back tax credits for EV purchases and manufacturing that Congress passed during Biden's term.
We will revoke the electric vehicle mandate, saving our auto industry and keeping my sacred pledge to our great American auto workers.
But he will need congressional approval for such a move. Analysts say it's counterproductive to Trump's own stated goals of competing with China, who is already the world's largest producer of EVs.
There's a consensus among the academia that EV is the way to go. EV is the way to address our environmental concern. There's no turning back on the EV development.
Trump's Inauguration Day actions also included an order to withdraw the U.S. from international climate commitments.
The next item, sir, is a letter that will be transmitted to the United Nations explaining that we are withdrawing from the Paris Climate Treaty.
The U.S. is currently producing more oil and gas than any country at any time in history. Meanwhile, even as it keeps much of its fossil fuel production, China is the leading manufacturer of solar panels and wind turbines globally. It is also the planet's biggest climate polluter. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
Around 50 survivors joined world leaders Monday at the site of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz, Poland, on the 80th anniversary of its liberation in World War II, commemorated worldwide as International Holocaust Memorial Day. Henry Ridgwell reports.
In front of the so-called Death Gate, through which millions of Jews and other prisoners were led to their deaths, around 50 survivors of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz gathered Monday alongside world leaders to mark the 80th anniversary of its liberation.
We were victims in a moral vacuum. But today, however, we have an obligation not only to remember, which is very, very important, but also to warn and to teach that hatred only begets more hatred.
On January 27, 1945, Red Army troops liberated Auschwitz, the largest of the 6 Nazi extermination camps. What they found continues to haunt humanity. Industrial human slaughter, the apparatus of a regime determined to wipe out the entire Jewish race. A genocide conducted over 4.5 years, planned and executed with meticulous detail. The Nazis' so-called final solution. An estimated 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz, 1 million of them Jews, but also Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war and other nationalities. Victims were stripped and forced into packed gas chambers. Others were shot, beaten to death, or died from disease, starvation and exposure. Bodies were burned or buried in mass graves.
As soon as I got off the wagon, I was immediately hit by the smell, the one I knew from Treblinka, the smell of burning bodies.
Germany now embraces an official culture of remembrance, a duty to take responsibility for the Holocaust.
We keep alive the memory of the breach of civilization committed by Germans in the Holocaust and convey it to every generation in our country again and again. Our responsibility never ends.
But the anniversary comes amid growing fears over the rise of the far right in Germany and beyond, concerns voiced by many Auschwitz survivors.
Let us be very serious, and let us take seriously what the enemies of democracy preach. They generally seek to implement these slogans they promote.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did not attend the Auschwitz commemorations. Netanyahu is subject to an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for suspected war crimes committed during Israel's war on Hamas, which he denies. Israel was instead represented by Education Minister Yoav Kish. Relatives of the dozens of Israeli hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza also travelled to Poland, while survivors of the October 7, 2023 attack joined Holocaust survivors at memorial events in Israel. Henry Ridgwell, VOA News.
Still to come, a partnership to erase neglected tropical diseases. We'll be right back.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, fighting rages in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo city of Goma as the M23 rebels entered the city and clashed with the Congo military. Residents are fleeing and the humanitarian crisis is deepening. Join me, Peter Clotty, for an in-depth discussion on the crisis in Eastern Congo.
In other news, a group of Zimbabwe's Liberation War veterans are calling on President Emmerson Mnangagwa to step down. The veterans affiliated with the ruling ZANU-PF party accuse the president of nepotism, corruption, and failing to address the poor economy. ZANU-PF party leaders say they are not taking the calls seriously. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has announced that his office will be seeking arrest warrants for those accused of atrocities in Sudan's West Darfur region, which has seen reported ethnic cleansing by paramilitary forces that have been fighting government forces for 19 months. It's time for our health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with news on the decline in women's cancer testing. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther. Well, get this. Women's cancer testing has declined globally, according to the latest Hologic Global Women's Health Index. Only 10% of women worldwide reported that they were tested for any type of cancer in the past year, a 2% decrease from previous years. The index, which is a collaboration between Hologic Incorporated and Gallup, also found for the first time alarming low rates of HIV testing, less than 0.5% of women in the Middle East and North Africa, and only 6% globally. The African Union's development agency, NEPAD, and Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases, NTDs, have signed a historic agreement to strengthen efforts to eliminate neglected tropical diseases across Africa. NTDs is a group of 21 diseases and infections that can disable, disfigure, and be fatal. The partnership between NEPAD and Uniting aims to jointly implement and mobilize resources to support NEPAD's NTD program. For more insight, I spoke with Ruth Ransberg, a senior resource mobilization advisor at Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases. Take a look.
Neglected tropical diseases are a group of diseases as defined by the World Health Organization. And they include things like Buruli ulcer and guinea worm and leprosy and bilharzia. It's quite a long list. And unfortunately, they affect people who are poor and most vulnerable. 40% of the global disease burden is housed in Africa, so close to half. And at the end of the day, what they do is that they perpetuate cycles of poverty and ill health for people who can literally afford it least. I think the major challenges around NTDs in Africa are that, unfortunately, we have a number of health pressures, of health, budget line items that are needing to be stretched much further than they can go. So with neglected tropical diseases, we need the political will, we need the political attention and resource allocation to ensure that people who are affected by these diseases, which can both debilitate, deform, and eventually kill, that they would have a chance, and they would have a chance at a healthy future.
African Union's Development Agency and Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases have signed an agreement towards the elimination of NTDs across Africa. What is the significance of this partnership?
So NEPAD is the development agency of the African Union, and their job is to give life to Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 is the longest strategy in Africa. It's up to 50 years. And at the end of the day, what they're wanting to do is to create the Africa we want. We believe that the Africa we want is without disease. We believe that the Africa we want can show and record that NTDs have been eliminated across the board.
What types of resources will be mobilized through this partnership, and how will these resources be distributed and utilized?
At the end of the day, we are raising support together through this partnership, and we're hoping to rely on support from the African Development Bank, as the Oude Nepad CEO mentioned at the signing. And what we will do is use the money to work in 3 African countries that have NTDs that are endemic to them, to prove the investment case, to prove the opportunity that we have to end NTDs in our lifetime. If one considers like a 1 to 25 investment, for every $1 spent, there's a $25 return in terms of the quality of life and increased health for people living in Africa. We can only achieve these things through political will first. And we need to push that on to momentum that brings about change.
Africa has made considerable progress, with 21 countries eliminating at least one NTD. What is your reaction, and how will this partnership build on these successes?
I mean, I think that that's absolutely fabulous. And frankly, if Africa is the stage that we are looking at to see what's possible, to see how healthcare can be improved, then I say amen. Africa has done great work in terms of NTDs, but the road is still very far. And what we need to do still needs more work, more political will, and more financial support.
When you look at how things have evolved, how would you assess the work that Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases have been able to accomplish so far?
I think that Uniting has done amazing work. We have what we call the Kigali Declaration Commitment Tracker, which is available on our website. And what we do there is that we show what different donors, what different countries are doing to end the tide of NTDs. And if anything, we would encourage countries to go on there, list what you're doing, list how it's working. Because I think in this global economic environment where things are so challenging, let's tell a success story.
That was Ruth Ransberg, a senior resource mobilization advisor at Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases. And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on X at Lenore Moudou. Back to you, Esther. Thanks, Lenore. Be sure to watch Lenore Moudou's health reports every Tuesday right here on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.